A pleasant surprise at the end of a country road. A beautiful break in a modern metropolitan landscape. These are the Lord's Lighthouses, a tour of cherished historic church buildings. Architectural historian Bob Gamble describes Otaugaville Methodist as a plain old country Greek revival church.
It has two doors, too, that open onto the recessed portico at the front of the church. And these two doors were very, very typical of Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian churches in the early 1800s and right on up to the early 1900s because of gender separation in the congregation. Generally, the men would sit on one side and the women and young children would sit on the other side, and they tended to enter separate doors, and then they would all kind of mingle after church on the portico and in the churchyard.
You'll notice that the steeple isn't unique. Normally you see steeples that are pointed or steeples that have crosses on them. Steeple here at the Otaugaville Methodist Church is a steeple that has what they call a crown of thorns. Has the various spikes up, one on each corner, one in the center. That's unique. There's not supposed to be but about 5 or 6 of those in the United States. And that is one of the unique features of this church, is the steeple. The chandelier here in the church is a chandelier that has been here since this building was built. And so this is the original chandelier, but if you'll notice, they have changed from kerosene, they've translated it over and changed it over to where it will be electric. So even though it's the old original chandelier, we still use it today.
It reflects the opulence of that antebellum planter community in the 1850s, the last decade just before the Civil War, when cotton prices were high and the plantation and cotton economy was very much flourishing. And architecturally speaking, that church is also one of the best Greek Revival country churches of any denomination in the state of Alabama. It has a classic academic facade, a Greek Revival facade with the recessed portico with 2 columns that are not equidistant, but rather they're spaced unevenly so as to focus on the central door, which opens into the sanctuary.
Narrow, steep steps located off one side of the portico lead to the slave gallery. The benches are original.
This building was built when 40 people raised $2,800 to erect the building in 1854. And the interior is as perfect in detail as the exterior is. It has the Ionic columns supporting the slave gallery, and the windows are Egyptian influence in that they are wide at the bottom than they are at the top.
The contractor that did the renovating of the church, and this was in 1958, I believe it was, when he jacked up the rear of the church to repair or replace the pillars under the church. The old brick had deteriorated to the point that they were going to have to be replaced, and he jacked the church up, and he was surprised that the old building lifted up all the way across like a box. it's just amazing to see the material, the structure that went into the building.
Russell Wood says cracks in the old plaster were creative distractions for the imagination.
And I know when I was a boy, a lot of times, rather than paying too much attention to the sermon, I would sit there and look up in that maze of cracks in the ceiling, and you could just imagine all sorts of figures, you know, that you could put together. Some places it was cracked to the point you saw the lath, you know, the plaster had begun to fall out. But you could see the state of Alabama, maybe Georgia, some of the others in the cracks, the way it ran. Of course, when you stop and think about the location of the church and the time, and being in a rural area, an agricultural section, that there's no residents within a half a mile or 3/4 of a mile of the church, and to think that every winter they set the woods on fire and burned the woods to keep, after the advent of the boll weevil, was to keep the boll weevil from having a place to overwinter through the winter. And to think that a building out there, as isolated as it is, that has come this 150 years, is just amazing.
O.E. Howard says the most attractive feature of Verbena United Methodist Church is the ceiling.
I think it was built about 1922, 23, something like that. And Mr. Sid Gibson, whose big house is on the corner down at the railroad, he did some of the carpenter work, and my uncle did some of it. But it was his design. It was Mr. Gibson's design. This is the outstanding feature of this church, I suppose, is the ceiling. In 1928, I was 10 years old, and we had a Methodist evangelist came through, and he preached one of those old hellfire and brimstone weeks, and scared me so bad I joined the church. When I first moved here in 1925, they had not built a schoolhouse up there. They were using this church sanctuary for schoolroom. And that's the reason you see some of the carvings on the benches. Some of the boys took their pocket knives and carved some initials on the back of the benches, so if you look closely, you'll see some of those. And Verbena was a little resort community that was populated mostly by summer visitors who came out of Montgomery to escape the yellow fever. Must have been about 1860 or 65, somewhere along that the Howards came. We've been in here ever since, and I'm the last one. So when I moved, the Howards would be gone for the first time in 150 or so years.
Today, Havana is a small community in West Alabama, but Audrey Elmore says there used to be a lot of folks in Havana, Alabama a long time ago.
Yes, sir. At one time, I can remember when they had 7 stores up there. We have 1 now. On Saturday, you couldn't get through it up there. All the mules and the wagons and the people come in to buy groceries for the next week. It was a busy place back then. Everybody was farming. That's all they had was farming. We didn't have television. Most of the people walked to church. Some of them walked as far as 3 miles to come to church. Well, that's the only entertainment we had back those days. You only outing you had was going to church. And people enjoyed going. Meet the neighbors. Talk about the other fellow. I can remember when you couldn't hardly get a seat in this church. And it's just vacant now, just very few of us, about 20 of us, still stick with it. I'm proud to be a member of it.
5 college presidents were members of Havana Methodist Church, including Julia Tutwiler. She was president of Livingston Normal School, later called Livingston University, and known today as the University of West Alabama. Her grave is located in the Havana Methodist Church's cemetery. Julia Tutwiler was a well-known promoter of education, an advocate for prison reform, and the author of Alabama's state song.
Interestingly, Methodists had many early Methodists, in fact most in the earliest days of Methodism in the United States and Great Britain, had a strong prejudice against musical instruments. This caused entire congregations to split. But in the 1850s and especially 1860s and after the Civil War, organs began to creep into Methodist worship services. The first Methodist organ that we know of in the United States was one installed in a church in Maine in 1836. Down here in Alabama, it was really not until after the Civil War that organs began to appear inside Methodist churches, and they, for the most part, were pump organs, or what they would have called melodeons or harmoniums. The big pipe organ didn't really occur until the late 1880s and 1890s.
Gothic is equated with arches and masonry. However, when this architectural theme is created in wood, it is called Carpenter's Gothic. Livingston United Methodist Church is a fine example of Carpenter's Gothic. We are visiting Livingston during the season of Advent. Many churches have a hanging of the green service after Thanksgiving. The sanctuary is adorned with garland, poinsettias, wreaths, candles, and a Chrismon tree. Each ornament is a symbol relating to Christ.
Okay, on our tree we have almost 80, if not more, Chrismons, and these are all, there are no repetitions, I don't believe. The cross and crown is very predominant, very beautiful. We have the chalice, we have the anchor cross, we have we have the Passion Cross. The Passion Cross does have the 4 red stones on it, on each point of the cross, symbolizing, of course, the blood of Christ. We're hoping that the congregation, when they see these chrismons, will immediately be reminded of what they stand for. That's the whole reason behind having a Chrismon tree. The workshop that we're having today is mainly to educate, hopefully, the young children of what, seeing the fish or seeing the shamrock or seeing the any of these, they'll immediately identify them with Jesus Christ. And this has been my love for many, many years.
Another unique feature of Livingston United Methodist Church are the needlepoint kneelers. They add symbolic beauty to the church.
And each kneeler is surrounded by a crown of thorns, and each one has a different symbol. In this case, the 3 fish, which are the 3 portions of the Trinity. These were financed by various persons that were asked to finance this project, and so there is an in memory on the back of each pillow.
Dayton United Methodist Church is one of the oldest churches in Marengo County, Alabama, a Greek revival-style structure built with slave labor. Dayton Methodist Church has a raised sanctuary. Slaves gathered on the first floor with a preacher specifically sent to lead a worship service for slaves. The circuit rider's room is also located on the first floor. The traveling preacher's original cot and washstand are still in the quarters. The most striking feature of the sanctuary is the chandelier. Brought to Dayton from France in 1849, it remains basically untouched, except for the addition of electric lighting. Miriam McKnight has been a church member for over 80 years. Today, she faithfully attends services in this rural small membership church.
We used to have a lot of people in Dayton at one time. Like I said, at one time it had a large membership. When World War II started, so many people in Dayton, the ones that were aged had to go in the service, and then the others left Dayton and, were glad to get jobs in the factories and places that, because it was, the Depression. So we haven't built up to have a membership since then.
Brewersville United Methodist Church would receive Bishop Francis Asbury's stamp of approval. It is a simple structure without a steeple or belfry. Yet Brewersville Methodist Church's serene setting in the country is quite attractive and soothing to the soul. Establishing the actual date of construction was a considerable task. Finally, the date 1840 was found carved into one of its large floor beams underneath the building. Violet Reed describes what she believes to be the most attractive feature of Brewersville United Methodist Church.
The pulpit, with maybe the little fancier than most pulpits at this time, because the historian for the Methodist Association could not actually find a date when the church was built, and it was around, they thought, 1840. And the state architect has been here and looked, and he said maybe it was someone from New England and was a little ahead of himself in making it as fancy as it is.
A slave gallery wraps around 3 walls of the sanctuary. Brewersville Methodist Church was built when cotton was king, and slave labor was used to harvest this cash crop. The church was established only 10 years after this territory in West Alabama was opened to white settlers. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed in 1830. The original pews with the partition remain intact. Men sat on one side of the sanctuary, then the women and children sat on the other side. Brewersville Methodist Church is one of the oldest and least altered church buildings in Alabama. Jefferson United Methodist Church is a Greek revival-style structure. During the Depression of the 1930s and several decades to follow, the building fell into disrepair. However, in the 1970s, local residents rallied together to refurbish the 1856 building. In the 1990s, meticulous work was completed to renovate Jefferson Methodist Church to its original state. Replicas of the original shutters were installed, and the original chandeliers were repaired. Church members loved the way the large clear glass windows seem to harmonize nature with worship. Parishioners can enjoy the sermon and view the colorful foliage, squirrels, and birds through the 6 windows along each side of the building. The pulpit is raised 6 feet above the floor, still far from crowding the space below an 18-foot ceiling. Ann Vickers remembers when the pews were packed for revival meetings, and she sat with the rest of the youth.
I can remember the revivals that we used to have. Then they didn't stop with 3 days like they do now. We had a revival for a week or more. And there was one particular gentleman who came from
out the edge of Jefferson here, that after the preacher preached, he would call on him to close the service, so we got another sermon. You remember? Yes. So we got 2 sermons. Of course, that wasn't the most appealing thing to us young folks. We wanted to get out, you know.
By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution arrived in America. People left the countryside to live in the cities and work in the factories. From the 1940s to the present, a majority of the U.S. population resides in suburbs. Both urban and rural churches have experienced a tremendous drop in church attendance. It is amazing that any of these 19th century church buildings remain in the sparsely populated countryside. The purpose of the Lord's Lighthouses is to document the historical significance and architectural beauty of these historic church buildings while they are still standing. The number of people with a long-term perspective of their community and church is dwindling. As time passes by, the ability to record the stories behind the churches will become more difficult. It's impractical to care for all the 1800s church buildings scattered across the countryside, but we can record their beauty and stories for future prosperity. Thank you for joining me on this tour of historic church buildings, the Lord's Lighthouses. I hope that we will see each other again as we travel down more roads and see other historic church buildings.